scientists have made a discovery that has changed the usual picture of the world. They recorded the voices of the dead and heard messages from the other side of the world. Death, as it turned out, is not the end. The first experiments caused shock, and some researchers refused to continue, faced with the unexplainable. Perhaps the soul does not disappear after death, but goes into another state. What are those who are already gone trying to tell us? Today we will consider the most mysterious cases of contact with the other world and try to understand whether the dead can really communicate with us. Imagine that your body becomes light and the sounds around you become silent. Then darkness comes, but it's not a void, it's a transition. You feel something pulling you upward, into the unknown, where pain, fear, and anxiety disappear. Thousands of people around the world who have experienced clinical death describe similar sensations. François Brun, who has studied this phenomenon, argued that stories of the afterlife existed long before psychiatrist Raymond Moody coined the term near-death experience in 1975. One of the first recorded cases occurred during World War I. German professor Eckhard Wiesenhuttern recorded the account of a young soldier who was severely wounded and on the verge of life and death. The soldier saw his bleeding body, heard the screams of his comrades, but felt no pain. Instead, a feeling of absolute freedom and peace enveloped him. He did not want to return, but an unknown force forced him back into his body. One of the most famous cases is the experience of George Ritchie, an American who contracted a severe form of pneumonia in his youth. His condition worsened and at one point doctors recorded cardiac arrest. A few minutes later he woke up, but not in his own body. He saw his own lifeless body lying on a hospital bed. Ritchie tried to grab his belongings, but his hands went through the objects. He tried to shout to the doctors, but no one heard his voice. In a panic, he ran out of the room and noticed that he was moving with incredible ease. At that moment he realized that he was no longer attached to his body. It was as if he was being pulled upward, and he found himself in another space, light, filled with a warm glow. He saw unfamiliar figures, but he felt an infinite love from them. A luminous being appeared before him, radiating absolute understanding and compassion. This encounter changed his perception of life and death forever. Most people who have experienced clinical death describe similar details, leaving the body, traveling through a dark tunnel, feeling incredibly peaceful, and meeting a luminous being. Some say they were shown the past, all their actions and feelings. Others have heard the message that their time has not yet come and they must return. Why are these stories repeated over and over again in different countries by people of different ages and cultures? Could this be evidence that consciousness continues to exist separate from the body? Perhaps the answer has been in front of our eyes for a long time, but we just aren't ready to accept it. One of the most frightening yet fascinating questions that has plagued humanity since ancient times: can we contact those who have already passed on? Thousands of people around the world claim that yes, they tell of strange voices, invisible presences, feeling a glance behind them, or even distinct conversations with those who are no longer among the living. Mediums claim to have the gift of hearing the dead, seeing them and transmitting their messages. In ancient Greece, oracles received messages from gods and ancestors. In medieval Europe, shamans communicated with spirits, and in the 19th century spiritualism became a whole movement, in which even famous scientists and writers such as Arthur Conan Doyle took part. One of the most mysterious stories collected by François Brun is related to a worker who died on the job, but did not even realize that he was no longer in the world of the living. He returned home as if nothing had happened and saw his loved ones. His family was sitting in the living room and the atmosphere in the house was filled with despair and tears. He tried to get their attention, but no one heard or saw him. At that moment a neighbor who had psychic powers entered the house. She stopped in the doorway as if sensing something. Her gaze traveled around the room, but didn't catch him. She didn't see him, but somehow she knew he was here. His roommate had explained that he no longer belonged in this world, that he was stuck between realities and had to move on. Slowly he began to realize that he was something else now. He remembered the last minutes of his life, the thud, the screaming of his colleagues, then the silence and the cold. One of the last messages he gave to his family was, "It's a shame people aren't taught this. If they knew that life goes on, the fear of death would disappear." These words reflect not only his emotions, but also what François Brun had been saying for years. François Brun collected hundreds of similar stories. He claimed that people with special sensitivity can indeed perceive signals from the afterlife. But is it a gift or a curse? Why are some people able to hear the dead and others not? Perhaps it is not about supernatural abilities, but about the level of openness to the unknowable. After all, if we accept this idea, then death ceases to be a terrible end and becomes a new chapter of existence. So what really happens after death? Maybe the answer has always been around, but we've just been afraid to hear it. What if the dead really can talk to us? But not in imagination, not in dreams, not through the mediation of mediums, but with the help of technology that man himself has created. Imagine, you turn on a tape recorder, record silence, and then when you listen you hear a faint, barely discernible voice. He's saying your name. It's trying to say something, and it's not just noise or radio interference. The voice is answering questions, relaying messages, communicating information that cannot be written off as coincidence. In the middle of the 20th century, scientists and enthusiasts began to record a strange phenomenon. On tape recordings appeared voices that no one heard during the recording. At first, this was treated as equipment error, background noise, or interference. However, when these voices began to say meaningful phrases, answer questions, and even introduce themselves, researchers realized that this was not just a technical glitch. One of the first to study the phenomenon seriously was engineer George Meek. Being a skeptic, he initially thought it was all self-induced. However, in 1970 years, he met a medium who claimed to receive messages from a deceased scientist. This scientist, being on the other side, supposedly wanted to help the living establish a reliable connection with the afterlife. Mick couldn't ignore this possibility and decided to experiment. He placed the microphone in a completely isolated room, excluding any outside sounds. The medium asked questions, and when they later listened to the recording, there were barely audible voices in the silence. Some of these voices introduced themselves by giving their names. One of the most surprising cases was the voice of George Muller, an American physicist who died in 1967. He not only acknowledged his presence, but offered advice on how to improve the equipment so that the recording would be clearer. How could a man who was no longer alive give scientific advice? How could a voice from nowhere understand the intricacies of sound recording? Not all the messages were friendly or neutral. Some voices sounded disturbing, as if coming from places of suffering. "We are being tortured here," one recording boomed. "We are being punished," said another voice, barely audible, as if coming from far away. It seemed as if the souls trapped between worlds were taking every opportunity to deliver their message to the living. But there were also voices full of joy and light. "We are happy," they said. It's a beautiful world here, with eternal light all around us. These phrases sounded different, soft, calm, as if they came from another dimension filled with warmth and light. Realizing that such a discovery would cause a wave of skepticism, George Meek decided to take his research to the public. He organized conferences where he demonstrated recordings, showed equipment, and tried to convince scientists that it was not a hallucination, a joke, or a fake. He wanted physicists, engineers, and psychologists to get involved in studying the phenomenon, but most of them refused to believe that it was possible to communicate with the dead. Despite this, the research continued. Over time, the recordings became more and more distinct, and the number of people receiving such results increased. Could this be considered proof of life after death? Or is it just an anomaly that science is not yet able to explain? One thing is certain: if the dead are really able to talk to us, they have already found a way to do it. And perhaps in the future this connection will become as obvious as telephone communication or radio waves, which once also seemed mystical. Sometimes communication with the dead occurs in the most unexpected ways. There are hundreds of cases in different countries where people have received phone calls from long-dead loved ones. The voices in the handset sounded clear, saying familiar phrases, sometimes even warning of danger. In some cases, the calls came from numbers that no longer existed or were buried with the owner. One of the most famous cases occurred in France on January 24, 1984. Madame Simone was talking to her daughter when suddenly a voice she had not heard for many years came through the receiver. "Good afternoon, grandchildren," the voice said. The stunned woman instantly recognized the voice of her father, who had died a few years ago. It was impossible to make a mistake. The intonation, the manner of speaking, even the joyful notes in the voice were exactly as she remembered them. When the connection was cut off, she tried to call back, but heard only short beeps. Later, she listened to the recording of the conversation and was convinced that it had not been a dream or imagination. This case is not the only one. There are testimonies of people who have received calls from the numbers of deceased relatives. One man received a call from his wife's number a month after she was killed in a car accident. One word came through the phone: "I'm sorry." Then the connection went dead, and when he tried to call back, it turned out that the number no longer existed. In another case, a woman found her late brother's voice on her answering machine saying, "Don't worry, I'm fine." However, the telephone company confirmed that the number had not been contacted that day. Can these phenomena be explained by technical failures, random coincidences, or peculiarities of electromagnetic fields? Or is it proof that the dead can find a way to contact us? Perhaps phone calls are the first faint signals from another world, and we just don't know how to perceive them correctly. François Brun was convinced that knowledge of life after death could change humanity. He drew an analogy with the discovery of the heliocentric system. It was once believed that the Earth was the center of the universe, but then it was proven that it revolved around the sun. So it is with the afterlife. Some people already know that consciousness does not die, while others remain in ignorance. In his opinion, if people realized that death is not the end, but only a transition, many fears would disappear and society would change. People would live consciously, would not be afraid of the inevitable, and would treat their actions differently. But like any great discovery, this truth requires readiness. Most people are afraid to look beyond the edge, because it shatters conventional wisdom. At the end of his life, Brun converted to orthodoxy and became a priest. He did not see a contradiction between science and religion; on the contrary, he considered them parts of a single knowledge. His last wish is inscribed on his gravestone: Father Francois, Orthodox priest. I am not here. This message reflects his conviction. Death is only a transition and life continues in a different form. He believed that one day humanity would realize this truth and stop fearing the inevitable.